Alrighty, welcome back to another episode of Mecha Mondays. I am your intrepid pilot narrator Fragath, and today we are going to be, I believe, wrapping up the last chunklet of Waldo, Genius in Orbit by Robert Heinlein. Um, don't lose the page, please. Thank you. Um, It is typically comes in a set with two stories, which one is Waldo and the other is Magic Incorporated. Um, as you can see, we're clearly segueing into the reason why the second one is thematically relevant. Um, I do plan on reading Magic Incorporated as well. We'll be doing that next week. Yeah, it looks like we should be able to get to that. No problem. No problem. I just have to figure out where I left off before because I don't know. Um, yeah, there we did. That's probably it. So previously on, what has happened thus far? Good question, Frag. Good question. So there's this guy. His name is Waldo. He lives in orbit because he's got, like I don't know, muscular dystrophy or something. I don't know. Something myasthenia. Good job. Basically, myasthenia gravis. There we go. He's extremely weak physically. He's physically extremely weak. Doing anything is a massive effort for him. So he's moved himself to orbit. He has basically overcome being weak by being ridiculously smart. Very, very good is at solving problems, and if he sets himself to an engineering task, he's able to accomplish it. Um, with minimal difficulty. Right now, though, he's been given quite a doozy of a problem by North American Power Air. I believe that's their name. Um, who have the patents to the DeKalb, which allows for energy to be beamed to vehicles so that they can fly and all that sort of happy joy, blissful, futuristic, Jetsonian future type antics. Unfortunately, DeKalbs appear to be failing for no discernible reason whatsoever, and they should not fail. They not because they're indestructible, but because there's just no reason for these DeKalbs to be failing. Um, Waldo's been given the task of fixing this, even though he has extreme beef with NAPA, North American Power Air, because they stole his patents. Well, they didn't. A guy who worked for him kinda did, and then the patents defaulted to North American Power Air, and Waldo is salty and bitter about that. Basically, he wants the company to burn in the ground. Um, and yet, he does recognize, or has been convinced to recognize, that there is at least some need for him to ensure that human civilization keeps ticking over, because he lives in orbit. And, he needs supplies. Those come from the ground, so he needs those. Um, so yeah. Uh, it turns out there's a guy named Gramps Schneider who's old! Exclamation point and italicized. Um, who has been able to fix some DeKalbs, um, making them do all kinds of eldritch moving that they're not supposed to do at all. Um, so Waldo, uh, left with no other recourse, has to go down to Earthside, even though it physically pains him to do that, because he can barely support his own weight. Um, not because he's massively fat or anything. He is overweight, but like because he has just no muscular. His musculature is extremely weak. Um, and meet with this Gramps Schneider face to face. And Gramps Schneider gives him some apparent hullabaloo about drawing power from the other world and making things work. Basically mind over matter stuff, I guess. Uh, and just kind of making things work. And Waldo's like, okay. I can't really think of any better explanation for why this would work, so we're going to go with that. Basically magic. And he's like, well, I'm going to attempt to engineer a solution based on that premise. See if I can figure out the rules and see if I can fix it. And that's basically where we've left off, because things are getting worse. More DeKalbs are failing. Um, Also, a scientist or researcher working for North American Power Air named Rambeau uh, has gone apparently deliriously insane at the revelation that the world is in fact filled with magic, and nobody saw fit to inform him. So he figures out, oh hey, I figured out how magic works, and boop, he just f's off. He just walks off. He's like, magic's real. I'm dipping. He didn't kill himself, we don't think, but he just left. He's like, yeah, no, I'm crazy. I'm walking on ceilings, you know, because why not? He goes full Looney Tunes, like full Looney Tunes. You could drop an anvil on his head, he would flatten out into a one-dimensional or two-dimensional plane, and then turn 3D again. It's pretty wild. At least I posit that that's what he would do. So yeah. Now, what was the last paragraph here? What was that last paragraph? Uh, here we go. You'll get your results, Waldo said loftily. I'm in the final stages of the research. He was not actually that confident, but Stevens irritated him even more than most of the smooth apes. Doubt and reassurance mingled in Stevens' face. I don't suppose you could care to give us a hint of the general nature of the solution? No, Waldo could not. Still, it would be fun to pull Stevens' leg. Come close to the pickup, Dr. Stevens. I'll tell you. He leaned forward himself until they were almost nose to nose. In effect. Magic is loose in the world. He cut the circuit at once. Down in the underground labyrinth of North America's home plant. Yes, plant. I thought I misread that for a sec. Stevens stared at the blank screen. What's the trouble, Chief? McLeod inquired. I don't know. I don't rightly know. But I think that Fatty has slipped his cams, just the way Rambeau did. McLeod grinned delightedly. Oh, sweet. I always did think he was a hoot owl. Hoot owl. Always did think he was a hoot owl. Stevens looked very sober. You had better pray that he hasn't, God nuts. We're depending on him. Now let me see those operation reports. And with that, we get started on where we left off. So, Waldo may or may not have a solution to the problem. And it may or may not be actual magic. More on that later. Okay. Let me just bang down a little water here, and or slosh down, whatever. Water will be imbibed, and we will continue reading. Magic loose in the world. It was as good an explanation as any, Waldo mused. Causation gone haywire, sacrosanct physical laws no longer operative. Magic. As Gramps Schneider had put it, it seemed to depend on the way one looked at it. Apparently, Schneider had known what he was talking about, although he naturally had no real grasp of the physical theory involved in the DeKalbs. Wait a minute now. Wait a minute. He had been going at this problem wrongly, perhaps. He had approached it with a certain point of view himself, a point of view which had made him critical of the old man's statements, an assumption that he, Waldo, knew more about the whole matter than Schneider did. To be sure he had gone to see Schneider, but he had thought of him as a back-country hex doctor, a man who might possess one piece of information useful to Waldo, but who was basically ignorant and superstitious. Suppose he were to review the situation from a different viewpoint. Let it be assumed that everything Schneider had to say was coldly factual and enlightened, rather than allegorical and superstitious. He settled himself to do a few hours of hard thinking. In the first place, Schneider had used the phrase "the other world" time and again. What did it mean, literally? A world? A world was a space-time energy continuum. An other world was, therefore, such a continuum, but a different one from the one in which he found himself. Physical theory found nothing repugnant in such a notion. The possibility of infinite numbers of continua was a familiar, orthodox speculation. It was even convenient in certain operations to make such an assumption. Had Gramps Schneider meant that? A literal, physical other world? On reflection, Waldo was convinced that he must have meant just that, even though he had not used conventional scientific phraseology. Other world sounds poetical, but to say an additional continuum implies physical meaning. The terms had led him astray. Schneider had said that the other world was all around, here, there, and everywhere. Well, was not that a fair description of a space superimposed and in one-to-one correspondence? Such a space might be so close to this one that the interval between them was an infinitesimal yet unnoticed and unreachable. What? I don't think you should have "and" there. Okay, let's try this sentence again. Such a space might be so close to this one that the interval between them was an infinitesimal yet unnoticed and unreachable, just as two planes might be considered as coextensive, yes, coextensive, and separated by unimaginably short intervals, yet be perfectly discrete, one from the other. The other space was not entirely unreachable. Schneider had spoken of reaching into it. The idea was fantastic, yet he must accept it for the purposes of this investigation. Schneider had implied, no, stated, that it was a matter of mental outlook. Was that really so fantastic? If a continuum were an unmeasurably short distance away, yet completely beyond one's physical grasp, would it be strange to find that it was most easily reached through some subtle and probably subconscious operation of the brain? The whole matter was subtle, and heaven knew that no one had any real idea of how the brain works. No idea at all. It was laughably insufficient to try to explain the writing of a symphony in terms of the mechanics of colloids. No, nobody knew how the brain worked. One more inexplicable ability in the brain was not too much to swallow. Come to think of it, the whole notion of consciousness and thought was fantastically improbable. All right, so McLeod disabled his sky car himself by thinking bad thoughts. Schneider fixed it by thinking the correct thoughts. Then what? He reached a preliminary conclusion almost at once. By extension, the other DeKalb failures were probably failures on the part of the operators. The operators were probably run down, tired out, worried about something, and in some fashion still not clear they infected or affected the DeKalbs with their own troubles. For convenience, let us say that the DeKalbs were short-circuited into the other world. Poor terminology, but it helped him form a picture. Grimes' hypothesis. Run down, tired out, worried about something. Not proved yet, but he felt sure of it. The epidemic of crashes through material was simply an aspect of the general myasthenia caused by short-wave radiation. If that were true, he cut in a sight-sound circuit to Earth and demanded to talk with Stevens.
Dr. Stevens, he began at once, there is a preliminary precautionary measure which should be undertaken right away.
Yes?
First, let me ask you this. Have you had many failures of DeKalbs in private ships? What is the ratio?
I can't give you exact figures at the moment, Stevens answered, somewhat mystified, but there have been practically none. It's just the commercial lines which have suffered.
Just as I suspected. A private pilot won't fly unless he feels up to it, but a man with a job goes ahead no matter how he feels. Make arrangements for special physical and psycho examinations for all commercial pilots flying DeKalb-type ships. Ground any who are not feeling in tip-top shape. Call Dr. Grimes. He'll tell you what to look for.
That's a pretty tall order, Mr. Jones. After all, most of those pilots, practically all of them, aren't our employees. We don't have much control over them.
That's your problem. Waldo shrugged. I'm trying to tell you how to reduce crashes in the interim before I submit my complete solution.
But Waldo heard no more of the remark. He had cut off when he himself was through. He was already calling over a permanently energized leased circuit which kept him in touch with his terrestrial business office, with his trained seals. He gave them some very odd instructions, orders for books, old books, rare books, books dealing with magic. Stevens consulted with Gleason before attempting to do anything about Waldo's difficult request. Gleason was dubious.
He offered no reason for the advice.
None. He told me to look up Dr. Grimes and get his advice as to what specifically to look for.
Dr. Grimes?
The MD who introduced me to Waldo. Mutual friend.
I recall. It will be difficult to go about grounding men who don't work for us. Still, I suppose several of our larger customers would cooperate if we asked them to, and gave them some sort of a reason. What are you looking so odd about?
Stevens told him of Waldo's last inexplicable statement. Do you suppose it could be affecting him the way it did Dr. Rambeau?
Could be, I suppose. In which case, it would not be well to follow his advice. Have you anything else to suggest?
No, frankly.
Then I see no alternative but to follow his advice. He's our last hope. A forlorn one, perhaps, but our only one.
Stevens brightened a little. I could talk to Doc Grimes about it. He knows more about Waldo than anyone else.
You have to consult him anyway, don't you? Very well, do so.
Oh, thank you for tuning in, Warren Steele. I'm sorry, I didn't see you until now. My apologies. Grimes listened to the story without comment. When Stevens had concluded, he said,
Waldo must be referring to the symptoms I've observed with respect to short-wave exposure. That's easy. You can have the proofs of the monograph I've been preparing. It'll tell you all about it.
The information did not reassure Stevens. It helped to confirm his suspicion that Waldo had lost his grip. But he said nothing. Grimes continued,
As for the other, Jim, I can't visualize Waldo losing his mind that way.
He never did seem very stable to me.
I know what you mean, but his paranoid streak is no more...
Oh, there we go.
His paranoid streak is no more like what...
Okay.
But his paranoid...
Oh no.
I know what you mean, but his paranoid streak is no more like what Rambo succumbed to than chicken pox is like mumps. Matter of fact, one psychosis protects against the other, but I'll go see.
You will? Good.
Can't go today. Got a broken leg and some children's colds that'll bear watching. Been some polio around. Ought to be able to make it to the end of the week, though.
Doc, why don't you give up GP work? It must be deadly.
Used to think so when I was younger, but about 40 years ago I quit treating diseases and started treating people. Since then, I've enjoyed it.
Waldo indulged in an orgy of reading, gulping the treatises on magic and related subjects as fast as he could. Yeah, there's absolutely no scene transition there. It's just right from one place to another over the course of a line. Waldo indulged in an orgy of reading, gulping the treatises on magic and related subjects as fast as he could. He had never been interested in such subjects before. Now, in reading about them with the point of view that there might be, and even probably was, something to be learned, he found them intensely interesting. There were frequent references to another world. Sometimes it was called the other world, sometimes the little world. Read with the conviction that the term referred to an actual, material, different continuum, he could see that many of the practitioners of the forbidden arts had held the same literal viewpoint. They gave directions for using this other world. Sometimes the directions were fanciful, sometimes they were baldly practical. It was fairly evident that at least 90% of all magic, probably more, was balderdash and sheer mystification. The mystification extended even to the practitioners, he felt. They lacked the scientific method. They employed a single-valued logic as faulty as the two-valued logic of the obsolete Spencer determinism. There was no suggestion of modern extensional, many-valued logic. Nevertheless, the laws of contiguity, of sympathy, and of homeopathy had a sort of twisted rightness to them when considered in relation to the concept of another, different, but accessible world. A man who had some access to a different space might well believe in a logic in which a thing could be, not be, or be anything with equal ease. Despite the nonsense and confusion which characterized the treatments of magic which dated back to the period when the art was in common practice, the record of accomplishment of the art was impressive. There was curare and digitalis and quinine, hypnotism and telepathy. There was the hydraulic engineering of the Egyptian priests. How's that magic? That's hydraulic engineering. Chemistry itself was derived from alchemy, for that matter. There's a semicolon there. Chemistry itself was derived from alchemy. For that matter, most modern science owed its origins to the magicians. Science had stripped off the surplusage. I don't think I've ever seen that word before, other than the fact that I've read this before. I know what surplus is. I don't think I've ever seen surplusage. Interesting. Science had stripped off the surplusage, run it through the wringer of two-valued logic, and placed the knowledge in a form in which anyone could use it. Unfortunately, that part of magic which refused to conform to the neat categories of the 19th century methodologists was lopped off and left out of the body of science. It fell into disrepute, was forgotten save as fable and superstition. Waldo began to think of the arcane arts as aborted sciences, abandoned before they had been clarified. And yet the manifestations of the sort of uncertainty which had characterized some aspects of magic, and which he now attributed to hypothetical additional continua, had occurred frequently, even in modern times. The evidence was overwhelming to anyone who approached it with an open mind. Poltergeisten, stones falling out of the sky, apportation, bewitched persons, or, as he thought of them, persons who, for some undetermined reason, were loci of uncertainty. Haunted houses, strange fires of the sort that would have once been attributed to salamanders. There were hundreds of such cases, carefully recorded and well vouched for, but ignored by orthodox science as being impossible. They were impossible by known law, but considered from the standpoint of a coextensive additional continuum, they became entirely credible. He cautioned himself not to consider his tentative hypothesis of the other world as proved. Nevertheless, it was an adequate hypothesis, even if it should develop that it did not apply to some of the cases of strange events. The other space might have different physical laws, no reason why it should not. Nevertheless, he decided to proceed on the assumption that it was much like the space he knew. The other world might even be inhabited. That was an intriguing thought. In which case, anything could happen through magic. Anything. Anything could happen through magic. Anything. Time to stop speculating and get down to a little solid research. He had previously he had wow, let's just eat syllables for breakfast.
Whole syllables gone, devoured, rendered unto nothing.
He had previously regretfully given up trying to apply the formulas of the medieval magicians. It appeared that they never wrote down all of a procedure. Some essential, so the reports ran and so his experience confirmed. Oh, okay. Some essential, so the reports ran and so his experience confirmed, was handed down verbally from master to student. His experience with Schneider confirmed this. There were things, attitudes, which must needs be taught directly. He regretfully set out to learn what he must unassisted. He regretfully set out to learn what he must unassisted. There we go.
Gosh, Uncle Gus, I'm glad to see you.
Decided I'd better look in on you. You haven't phoned me in weeks.
That's true, but I've been working awfully hard, Uncle Gus.
Too hard, maybe. Mustn't overdo it. Let me see your tongue.
I'm okay.
But Waldo stuck out his tongue just the same. Grimes looked at it and felt his pulse.
You seem to be ticking all right. Learning anything?
Quite a lot. I've about got the matter of the DeKalbs whipped.
That's good. The message you sent Stephen seemed to indicate that you had found some hookup that could be used on my pet problem, too. On my pet problem, too.
In a way, yes, but around from the other end. It begins to seem as if it was your problem which created Stephen's problem.
Huh?
I mean it. The symptoms caused by ultra-shortwave radiation may have had a lot to do with the erratic behavior of the DeKalbs.
How?
I don't know myself, but I've rigged up a working hypothesis, and I'm checking it.
Want to talk about it?
Certainly. To you?
Waldo launched into an account of his interview with Schneider, concerning which he had not previously spoken to Grimes, even though Grimes had made the trip with him. He never, as Grimes knew, discussed anything until he was ready to. The story of the third set of DeKalbs to be in... What? Oh, okay. The story of the third set of DeKalbs to be infected with the incredible writhings caused Grimes to raise his eyebrows.
Mean to say you caught on to how to do that?
Yes, indeed. Not how, maybe, but I can do it. I've done it more than once. I'll show you.
He drifted away toward one side of the great room where several sets of DeKalbs, large and small, were mounted, with their controls on temporary guys.
This fellow over on the end, it just came in today. Broke down. I'll give it Gramps Schneider's hocus pocus and fix it. Wait a minute. I forgot to turn on the power.
He returned to the central ring which constituted his usual locus and switched on the beamcaster. Since the ship itself effectively shielded anything in the room from outer radiation, he had installed a small power plant and caster similar in type to Nappa's giant ones. Without it, he would have had no way to test the reception of the DeKalbs. He rejoined Grimes and passed down the line of DeKalbs, switching on the activizing circuits. Yes, activizing. Sometimes getting accustomed to the more archaic cadence. Also, the cadence is particular to Heinlein himself. Does take some adjusting, particularly when I've been reading other things previously. Um, when I'm reading a minimum of 4 different books in a given week, yeah, I get a little lost. Yes, I read books on my own time while I'm not reading these. Shocker, I know. Where were we? Oh, yes. Since the ship itself effectively shielded anything in the room from outer radiation, he had installed a small power plant and a caster similar in type to Nappa's giant ones. Without it, he would have had no way to test the reception of the DeKalbs. Reception of the DeKalbs. Sorry. Keep eating syllables. I don't know what's going on. He rejoined Grimes and passed down the line of DeKalbs, switching on the activizing circuits. All save two began to display the uncouth motions he had begun to think of as the Schneider flex.
That one on the far end, he remarked, is in operation but doesn't flex. It has never broken down, so it's never been treated. It's my control. But this one, he touched the one in front of him, needs fixing. Watch me.
What are you going to do?
To tell the truth, I don't quite know, but I'll do it.
He did not know. All he knew was that it was necessary to gaze down the antennae, think about them reaching into the other world, think of them reaching for power, reaching. The antennae began to squirm.
That's all there is to it, strictly between ourselves. I learned it from Schneider.
They had returned to the center of the sphere, at Grimes' suggestion, on the pretext of wanting to get a cigarette. The squirming DeKalbs made him nervous, but he did not want to say so.
How do you explain it?
I regard it as an imperfectly understood phenomenon of the other space. I know less about it than Franklin knew of lightning. But I will know. I will! I could give Stevens a solution right now for his worries if I knew some way to get around your problem, too.
I don't see the connection.
There ought to be some way to do the whole thing through the other space. Start out by radiating power into the other space and pick it up from there. Then the radiation could not harm human beings. It would never get at them. It would duck around them. I've been working on my caster, but with no luck so far. I'll crack it in time.
I hope you do. Speaking of that, isn't the radiation from your own caster loose in this room?
Yes.
Then I'll put on my shield coat. It's not good for you either.
Never mind, I'll turn it off.
As he turned to do so, there was the sound of a sweet, chirruping whistle. Balder barked. Grimes turned to see what caused it.
What, he demanded, have you got there?
Huh? Oh, that's my cuckoo clock. Fun, isn't it?
Grimes agreed that it was, although he could not see much use for it. Waldo had mounted it on the edge of a light metal hoop which spun with a speed just sufficient to produce a centrifugal force of 1 g.
Why? Why would you do this?
Me and Optical Antenna had a brief interaction last week about why that seemed a highly impractical idea. I felt in my guts that it was like, there's something horribly wrong about this plan. It should not work. It shouldn't be viable. Or if it is, it would either be hazardous or at least highly impractical. And he actually gave the math. So if you can check out the, not the comments, but the actual typed text during the stream, I would definitely check that out. Because he maths it out. He's like, here's what would have to be going on, and it's not good. It's not good. I wouldn't want to be anywhere near the thing. It seems like it would be very dangerous. Because it's whizzing. It's whizzing. Sorry. Just sufficient. Speed just sufficient to produce a centrifugal force of 1 g.
I rigged it up, Waldo continued, while I was bogged down in this problem of the other space. Gave me something to do.
This other space business. I still don't get it.
Think of another continuum, much like our own, and superposed on it the way you might lay one sheet of paper on another. The two spaces aren't identical, but they are separated from each other by the smallest interval you can imagine. Coextensive, but not touching. Usually. There is an absolute one-to-one, point-for-point correspondence, as I conceive it, between the two spaces, but they are not necessarily the same size or shape.
Come again? They would have to be.
Not at all. Which is the longer number of points in it? A line an inch long or a line a mile long?
A mile long, of course.
No, they have exactly the same number of points. Want me to prove it?
I'll take your word for it, but I never studied that sort of math.
All right, take my word for it then. Neither size nor shape is any impediment to setting up a full point-for-point correspondence between two spaces. Neither of the words is really appropriate. Size has to do with a space's own inner structure, its dimensions in terms of its own unique constants. Shape is a matter which happens inside itself, or at least not inside our space, and has to do with how it is curved, open or closed, expanding or contracting.
Grimes shrugged. It all sounds like gibberish to me.
He returned to watching the cuckoo clock swing round and round and round its wheel.
Sure it does. Sure it does. Waldo assented cheerfully. We are limited by our experience. Do you know how I think of the other world?
The question was purely rhetorical.
I think of it as about the size and shape of an ostrich egg, but nevertheless a whole universe, existing side by side with our own, from here to the farthest star. I know that it's a false picture, but it helps me to think about it that way.
I wouldn't know, said Grimes, and turned himself around in the air. The compound motion of the clock's pendulum was making him a little dizzy.
Say, I thought you turned off the caster.
I did,
Waldo agreed, and looked where Grimes was looking. The DeKalbs were still squirming.
I thought I did,
he said doubtfully, and turned to the caster's control board. His eyes then opened wider.
But I did. It is turned off.
Then what the devil?
Shut up!
He had to think. Think hard. Was the caster actually out of operation? He floated himself over to it, inspected it. Yes, it was dead. Dead as the dinosaurs.
But they're not dead, they're just chickens. And chickadees. And turkeys.
And castle. I'm not going to name every bird, sorry. He floated himself over to it, inspected it. Yes, it was dead. Dead as the dinosaurs. Dead as the dinosaurs. I am eating these today. Just to make sure, he went back, assumed his primary Waldos, cut in the necessary circuits, and partially disassembled it. But the DeKalbs still squirmed. The one DeKalb set which had not been subjected to the Schneider treatment was dead. It gave out no power hum. But the others were working frantically, gathering power from where? He wondered whether or not McLeod had said anything to Gramps Schneider about the casters from which the DeKalbs were intended to pick up their power. Certainly he himself had not. It simply had not come into the conversation. But Schneider had said something.
The other world is close by and full of power.
In spite of his own intention of taking the old man literally, he had ignored that statement. The other world is full of power.
I'm sorry I snapped at you, Uncle Gus, he said.
It's all right.
But what do you make of that?
Looks like you've invented perpetual motion, son.
In a way, perhaps. Or maybe we've repealed the law of conservation of energy. Those DeKalbs are drawing energy from what are drawing energy that was never before in this world.
It's HM-M-M! I believe I got that correct. To check his belief, he returned to the control rig, donned his Waldos, cut in a mobile scanner, and proceeded to search the space around the DeKalbs with the most sensitive pickup for the radio power band he had available. The needles never jumped. The room was dead in the wavelengths to which the DeKalbs were sensitive. The power came from other space. The power came from other space. Not from his own beamcaster, not from Nappa's shiny stations, but from other space. In that case, he was not even close to solving the problem of the defective DeKalbs. He might never solve it. Wait now. Just what had he contracted to do? He tried to recall the exact words of the contract. There just might be a way around it. Maybe.
Yes, and this newest cockeyed trick of Gramps Schneider's little pets could have some very tricky aspects. He began to see some possibilities, but he needed to think about it. Uncle Gus,
Yes, Waldo?
you can go back and tell Stevens that I'll be ready with the answers. We'll get his problem licked, and yours too. In the meantime, I've got to do some really heavy thinking, so I want to be by myself, please. Greetings, Mr. Gleason. Quiet, Balder! Come in. Be comfortable. How do you do, Mr. Stevens?
How do you do, Mr. Jones?
This,
Said Gleason, indicating a figure trailing him.
is Mr. Harkness, head of our legal staff.
Ah, yes, indeed. There will be matters of contract to be discussed. Welcome to Freehold, Mr. Harkness.
Thank you, Harkness said coldly. Will your attorneys be present?
They are present.
Waldo indicated a stereo screen. Two figures showed in it. They bowed and murmured polite forms. This is most irregular, Harkness complained. Witnesses should be present in person. Things seen and heard by television are not evidence. Waldo drew his lips back.
Do you wish to make an issue of it?
Not at all, Gleason said hastily. Never mind, Charles.
Harkness subsided.
I won't waste your time, gentlemen, Waldo began. We are here in order that I may fulfill my contract with you. The terms are known. We will pass over them.
He inserted his arms into his primary Waldo's.
Lined up along the far wall, you will see a number of radiant power receptors, commonly called DeKalbs. Dr. Stevens may, if he wishes, check their serial numbers.
No need to.
Very well. I shall start my local beamcaster in order that we may check the efficiency of their operation.
His Waldos were busy as he spoke.
Then I shall activate the receptors, one at a time.
His hands pawed the air. A little pair of secondaries switched on the proper switches on the control board of the last set in line.
This is an ordinary type, supplied to me by Dr. Stevens, which has never failed in operation. You may assure yourself that it is now operating in the normal manner, if you wish, Doctor.
I can see that it is.
We will call such a receptor a DeKalb, and its operation normal.
The small Waldos were busy again.
Here we have a receptor which I chose to term a Schneider DeKalb, because of certain treatment it has received.
The antennae began to move.
And its operation Schneider type operation. Will you check it, Doctor?
Okay.
You fetched with you a receptor set which has failed.
As you can see.
Have you been able to make it function?
No, I have not.
Are you sure? Have you examined it carefully?
Quite carefully, Stevens acknowledged sourly. He was beginning to be tired of Waldo's pompous flubdubbery. Oh, new word. I gotta write that one down. I need flubdubbery in my life. I never knew that I needed flubdubbery so much. But I do. Next time I have a political chat, I'm going to throw that in there.
Just the relative merits of politics. Yeah, but they're filled with pompous flubdubbery, aren't they?
Very well. I will now proceed to make it operative.
Waldo left his control ring, shoved himself over to the vicinity of the defective DeKalb, and placed himself so that his body covered his exact actions from the sight of the others. He returned to the ring and, using Waldo's, switched on the activating circuit of the DeKalb. It immediately exhibited Schneider-type activity.
That is my case, gentlemen, he announced. "I have found out how to repair DeKalbs which become spontaneously inoperative. I will undertake to apply the Schneider treatment to any receptors which you may bring to me. That is included in my fee. I will undertake to train others in how to apply the Schneider treatment. That is included in my fee, but I cannot guarantee that any particular man will profit by my instruction. Without going into technical details, I may say that the treatment is very difficult, much harder than it looks. I believe that Dr. Stevens will confirm that." He smiled thinly. "I believe that completes my agreement with you."
Just a moment, Mr. Jones, put in Gleason. Is a DeKalb foolproof once it has received the Schneider treatment?
"Quite. I guarantee it." They went into a huddle while Waldo They went into a huddle while Waldo waited. There is some alliteration there. They went into a huddle while Waldo waited. At last Gleason spoke for them.
These are not quite the results we had expected, Mr. Jones, but we agree that you have fulfilled your commission, with the understanding that you will Schneider treat any receptors brought to you and instruct others according to their ability to learn.
"That is correct."
Your fee will be deposited to your account at once.
"Good. That is fully understood and agreed. I have completely and successfully performed your commission."
Correct.
"Very well, then. I have one more thing to show you, if you will be patient." A section of the wall folded back. Gigantic Waldos reached into the room beyond and drew forth a large apparatus, which resembled somewhat in general form an ordinary set of DeKalbs, but which was considerably more complicated. Most of the complications were sheer decoration, but it would have taken a skilled engineer a long time to prove the fact. The machine did contain one novel feature, a built-in meter of a novel type, whereby it could be set to operate for a predetermined time and then destroy itself, and a radio control whereby the time limit could be varied. Furthermore, the meter would destroy itself and the receptors if tampered with by any person not familiar with its design. It was Waldo's tentative answer to the problem of selling free and unlimited power. But of these matters he said nothing. Small Waldos had been busy attaching guys to the apparatus. When they were through, he said, "This, gentlemen, is an instrument which I choose to call a Jones-Schneider DeKalb, and it is the reason why you will not be in the business of selling power much longer."
So, said Gleason, may I ask why?
"Because," he was told, "I can sell it more cheaply and more conveniently and under circumstances you cannot hope to match."
That is a strong statement.
"I will demonstrate. Dr. Stevens, you have noted that the other receptors are operating. I will turn them off." The Waldos did so. "I will now stop the beamcast, and I will ask you to assure yourself, by means of your own instruments, that there is no radiant power, other than the ordinary visible light, in this room." Somewhat sullenly, Stevens did so.
The place is dead,
He announced some minutes later. "Good. Keep your instruments in place, that you may be sure it remains dead. I will now activate my receptor." Little mechanical hands closed the switches. "Observe it, Doctor. Go over it thoroughly." Stevens did so. He did not trust the readings shown by its instrument board. Something about that sentence is really throwing me. Stevens did so. He did not trust the readings shown by its instrument board. He attached his own meters in parallel.
How about it, James?
Gleason whispered.
Stevens looked disgusted. The damn thing draws power from nowhere.
They all looked at Waldo. "Take plenty of time, gentlemen," he said grandly. "Talk it over." They withdrew as far away as the room permitted and whispered. Waldo could see that Harkness and Stevens were arguing, that Stevens was noncommittal. That suited him. He was hoping that Stevens would not decide to take another look at the fancy gadget that he had termed a Jones-Schneider DeKalb. Stevens must not learn too much about it. Yet. He had been careful to say nothing but the truth about it, but perhaps he had not said all of the truth. He had not mentioned that all Schneider-treated DeKalbs were sources of free power. Rather embarrassing if Stevens should discover that. The meter and destruction device Waldo had purposely made mysterious and complex, but it was not useless. Later, he would be able to point out, quite correctly, that without such a device, Napa simply could not remain in business. Waldo was not easy. The whole business was a risky gamble. He would have much preferred to know more about the phenomena he was trying to peddle, but, he shrugged mentally while preserving a smile of smug confidence, the business had dragged on several months already, and the power situation really was critical. This solution would do, if he could get their names on the dotted line quickly enough. For he had no intention of trying to compete with Napa. Gleason pulled himself away from Stevens and Harkness, came to Waldo.
Mr. Jones, can't we arrange this amicably?
What have you to suggest? It was quite an hour later that Waldo, with a sigh of relief, watched his guest's ship depart from the threshold flat. A fine caper, he thought, and it had worked. He had gotten away with it. He had magnanimously allowed himself to be persuaded to consolidate, provided he had allowed himself to be quite temperamental about this. The contract was concluded at once, no fussing around and fencing between lawyers. Now or never, put up or shut up. The proposed contract, he had pointed out virtuously, gave him nothing at all unless his allegations about the Jones-Schneider DeKalb were correct. Gleason considered this point and had decided to sign. Had signed. Even then, Harkness had attempted to claim that Waldo had been an employee of NAPA. Waldo had written that first contract himself, a specific commission for a contingent fee. Harkness did not have a leg to stand on. Even Gleason had agreed to that. In exchange for all rights to the Jones-Schneider DeKalb, for which he had agreed to supply drawings, wait till Stevens saw and understood those sketches. For that he had received the promise of senior stock at Napa, non-voting, but fully paid up and non-assessable. The lack of active participation in the company had been his own idea. There were going to be more headaches in the power business, headaches aplenty. He could see them coming. Bootleg designs, means of outwitting and metering, lots of things. Free power had come, and efforts to stop it would, in the long run, he believed, be fruitless. Waldo laughed so hard that he frightened Balder, who set up an excited barking. He could afford to forget Hathaway now. His revenge on Napa contained one potential flaw. He had assured Gleason that the Schneider-treated DeKalbs would continue to operate, would not come unstuck. He believed that to be true simply because he had faith in Gramps Schneider, but he was not prepared to prove it. He knew himself that he did not know enough about the phenomena associated with the other world to be sure that something would or would not happen. It was still going to be necessary to do some hard, extensive research. But the other world was a devilishly difficult place to investigate. Suppose, he speculated, that the human race were blind, had never developed eyes. No matter how civilized, enlightened, and scientific no matter how civilized, enlightened, and scientific the race might have become, it is difficult to see how such a race could have ever developed the concepts of astronomy. They might know of the sun as a cyclic source of energy having a changing directional character, for the sun is so overpowering that it may be seen with the skin. They would notice it and invent instruments to trap it and examine it. But the pale stars, would they ever notice them? It seemed most unlikely. The very notion of the celestial universe, its silent depths and starlit grandeur, would be beyond them. Even if one of their scientists should have Even if one of their scientists should have the concept forced on him in such a manner that he was obliged to accept the fantastic, incredible thesis as fact, how then would he go about investigating its details? Waldo tried to imagine an astronomical phototelescope, conceived and designed by a blind man, intended to be operated by a blind man, and capable of collecting data which could be interpreted by a blind man. He gave it up. There were too many hazards. It would take a subtlety of genius far beyond his own to deal with the inescapably tortuous. Oh my God. Why would you put concatenations after that word? Come on, Heinlein, come on. He knew my Achilles heel. He knows I like the word concatenation, and it makes me stop everything. It would take a subtlety of genius far beyond his own to deal with the inescapably tortuous. That's got to be supposed to be torturous, and it's missing an R. That has to. Tortuous can't be a word. Can it? And now on Frags, Grammar Power Hour. Tortuos. Oh no, that's a word. I'm dumb. Never mind. It is in fact full of twists and turns, which, yeah, contextually, 100%. Never mind. I'm just illiterate. I don't read. Ha-ha! I'm an illiterate, ill-educated prole. Okay, let's try this sentence one more time. It would take a subtlety of genius far beyond his own to deal with the inescapably tortuous concatenations of inferential reasoning necessary to the solution of such a problem. I'm sure we could have set up a sentence that was less painful to read through. It would strain him to invent such instruments for a blind man. He did not see how a blind man could ever overcome the difficulties unassisted. In a way, that was what Schneider had done for him. Alone, he would have been bogged down. But even with Schneider's hints, the problem of investigating the other world was still much like the dilemma of the blind astronomer. He could not see the other world. Only through the Schneider treatment had he been able to contact it. Damnation! How could he design instruments to study it? He suspected that he would eventually have to go back to Schneider for further instruction, but that was an expedient so distasteful that he refused to think much about it. Furthermore, Gramps Schneider might not be able to teach him much. They did not speak the same language. This much he did know. The other space was there, and it could be reached sometimes by proper orientation of the mind, deliberately as Schneider had taught him, or subconsciously, as had happened to MacLeod and others. He found the idea distasteful. That thought and thought alone should be able to influence physical phenomena was contrary to the whole materialistic philosophy in which he had grown up. He had a prejudice in favor of order and invariable natural laws. His cultural predecessors, the experimental philosophers who had built up the world of science and its concomitant technology, Galileo, Newton, Edison, Einstein, Steinmetz, Jeans, and their myriad colleagues, it's probably Jean's, and their myriad colleagues, these men had thought of the physical universe as a mechanism proceeding by inexorable necessity. Any apparent failure to proceed thus was okay. It's because the sentence is cut off that I'm not sure where the weight and emphasis is supposed to be. Give me a sec. Any apparent failure to proceed thus was regarded. Yes, okay. Any apparent failure to proceed thus was regarded as an error in observation, an insufficient formulation of hypothesis, or an insufficiency of datum. Even the short reign of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle had not changed the fundamental orientation toward order and cosmos. The Heisenberg uncertainty was one they were certain of. The Heisenberg uncertainty was one they were certain of. It could be formulated, expressed, and a rigorous statistical mechanics could be built from it. In 1958, Horowitz's reformulation of wave mechanics had eliminated the concept. Order and causation were restored. Casual reminder that this was written before 1958. So that is fiction right there. Don't worry. Don't worry. This was written, depending on which publishing date you look at. The latest it could have been written was 1950. The earliest would be 1940. I think the normal figures I've read were like 1942-ish. I think 1940 is when it appeared in one of the science fiction pulps. Astounding Stories or similar. I don't remember which one offhand. And then got turned into a novel in 42, or a actual printed book rather, in 42. Where were we? Rights. In 1958, Horowitz's reformulation of wave mechanics had eliminated the concept. Order and causation were restored. But this damned business. One might as well pray for rain, wish on the moon, go to faith healers, surrender whole hog to Bishop Berkeley's sweetly cerebral world in your head. The tree's not a tree when there's no one about on the quad. Oh. So if a tree falls in the forest and crushes a mime, does anyone care? The great philosophical question. Sorry to all my viewers who are mimes. I'm not trying to attack you personally. Y'all just kind of creep me out. Sorry. I'm prejudiced. I apologize. And not just mimes. Anyone who puts on way too much makeup kind of spooks me. You can see how that could be problematic. It's a good thing I don't work for the circus. Where were we? Ah, yes. Waldo was not emotionally wedded to absolute order as Rimbaud had been. He was in no danger of becoming mentally unbalanced through a failure of his basic conceptions. Nevertheless, consarn it, it was convenient for things to work the way one expected them to. On order and natural law was based predictability. Without predictability, it was impossible to live. Clocks should run evenly. Water should boil when heat is applied to it. Food should nourish, not poison. DeKalb receptors should work the way they were designed to. Chaos was insupportable. It could not be lived with. Suppose chaos were king, and the order we thought we detected in the world about us a mere phantasm of the imagination. Where would that lead us? In that case, Waldo decided, it was entirely possible that a 10-pound weight did fall 10 times as fast as a 1-pound weight until the day the audacious Galileo decided in his mind it was not so. Perhaps the whole meticulous science of ballistics derived from the convictions of a few firm-minded individuals who had sold the notion to the world. Perhaps the very stars were held firm in their courses by the unvarying faith of the astronomers. Orderly cosmos created out of chaos by mind. And as you can see, the seeds were sown for the novel Quarantine by Gregg Egan. If you're not seeing a couple parallels here, I recommend you check that one out. It's pretty fun. It's pretty fun. I don't remember which of them No, I definitely read this before I read Quarantine, because I don't think I was aware of Gregg Egan until the aughts. I might have known about him shortly before the aughts, but definitely not until the late 90s. I didn't know he existed. Which is a shame, because he's great. I love Gregg Egan. I've been very fond.
Oh, I could gush for hours.
The world was flat before geographers decided to think of it otherwise. The world was flat, and the sun, tub-sized, rose in the east and set in the west. The stars were little lights, studding a pellucid dome which barely cleared the tallest mountains. Storms were the wrath of gods and had nothing to do with the calculus of air masses. A mind-created animism dominated the world then. More recently, a mind-created animism dominated the world then. More recently, it had been different. A prevalent convention of materialistic and invariable causation had ruled the world. On it was based the whole involved technology of a machine-served civilization. The machines worked the way they were designed to work because everybody believed in them. There is something in my eye and it stings. Stop it. Thank you. Until a few pilots, somewhat debilitated by overmuch exposure to radiation, had lost their confidence and infected their machines with uncertainty, and thereby let magic loose in the world. He was beginning, he thought, to understand what had happened to magic. Magic was the erratic law of an animistic world. It had been steadily pushed back by the advancing philosophy of invariant causation. It was gone now, until this new outbreak, and its world with it, except for backwaters of superstition. Naturally, an experimental scientist reported failure when investigating haunted houses, apportations, and the like. His convictions prevented the phenomena from happening. His convictions prevented the phenomena from happening. The deep jungles of Africa might be very different places, when there was no white man around to see. The strangely slippery laws of magic might still obtain. Perhaps these speculations were too extreme. Nevertheless, they had one advantage which orthodox concepts had not. They included Gramps Schneider's hexing of the DeKalbs. Any working hypothesis which failed to account for Schneider's, and his own, ability to think a set of DeKalbs into operation was not worth a continental. This one did, and it conformed to Gramps' own statements. All matters are doubtful, and a thing can both be, not be, and be anything. There are many true ways of looking at the same thing. Some ways are good, some are bad. Very well, accept it. Act on it. The world varied according to the way one looked at it. In that case, thought Waldo, he knew how he wanted to look at it. He cast his vote for order and predictability. He would set the style. He would impress his own concept of the other world on the cosmos. It had been a good start to assure Gleason that the Schneider-treated DeKalbs were foolproof. Good. So let it be. They were foolproof. They would never get out of order. He proceeded to formulate and clarify his own concept of the other world in his mind. He would think of it as orderly and basically similar to this space. The connection between the two spaces lay in the neurological system. The cortex, the thalamus, the spinal cord, and the appended nerve system were closely connected with both spaces. Such a picture was consistent with what Schneider had told him and did not conflict with phenomena as he knew it. Wait, if the neurological system lay in both spaces, then that might account for the relatively slow propagation of nerve impulses as compared with electromagnetic progression. Yes, if the other space had a C constant relatively smaller than that of this space, such would follow. He began to feel a calm assurance that it was so. Was he merely speculating or creating a universe? Perhaps he would have to abandon his mental picture of the other space as being the size and shape of an ostrich egg, since a space with a slower propagation of light is not smaller but larger than the space he was used to. No, wait a second. The size of a space did not depend on its C constant, but on its radius of curvature in terms of its C constant. Since c was a velocity, size was dependent on the notion of time, in this case, time as entropy rate. For anyone not in the know, c is shorthand for the speed of light. I think most people listening to this probably know that already, but I figured I'd get it out there just in case. So I'm not just talking about the ocean a lot. Or rather, Waldo isn't. In this case, time as entropy rate. Therein lay a characteristic which could be compared between the two spaces. They exchanged energy. They affected each other's entropy. The one which degenerated the more rapidly toward a state of level entropy was the smaller. He need not abandon his picture of the ostrich egg. Good old egg. The other world was a closed space, with a slow sea, a high entropy rate, a short radius, and an entropy state near level, a perfect reservoir of power at every point, ready to spill over into this space wherever he might close the interval. To its inhabitants, if any, it might seem to be hundreds of millions of light years around. To him, it was an ostrich egg, turgid to bursting with power. He was already beginning to think of ways of checking his hypothesis. If, using a Schneider DeKalb, he were to draw energy at the highest rate he could manage, would he affect the local potential? Would it establish an entropy gradient? Could he reverse the process by finding a way to pump power into the other world? Could he establish different levels at different points and thereby check for degeneration toward level maximum entropy? Did the speed of nerve impulse propagation furnish a clue to the sea of other space? Could such a clue be combined with the entropy and potential investigations to give a mathematical picture of the other space in terms of its constants and its age? We still have a fair amount of book left, by the way, so if you're getting a little lost, so am I. Possibly even worried. Downright concerned. He set about it. His untrammeled, wild speculations had produced some definite good. He'd tied down at least one line of attack on that other space. He'd devised a working principle for his blind man's telescope mechanism. Whatever the truth of the thing was, it was more than a truth. It was a complete series of new truths. It was the very complexity of that series of new truths, the characteristic laws, that were inherent properties of the other space, plus the new truth laws resultant from the interaction of the characteristics of the other space with normal space. No wonder Rambeau had said anything could happen. Almost anything could, in all probability, by a proper application and combination of the three sets of laws. The laws of our space, the laws of other space, and the coordinate laws of both spaces. But before theoreticians could begin work, new data were most desperately needed. Waldo was no theoretician. A fact he had admitted left-handedly in thinking of theory as impractical and unnecessary, time waste for him as a consulting engineer. Let the smooth apes work it out. But the consulting engineer had to find out one thing. Would the Schneider DeKalbs continue to function uninterruptedly as guaranteed? If not, what must be done to assure continuous function? The most difficult and the most interesting aspect of the investigation had to do with the neurological system in relation to other space. Neither electromagnetic instruments nor neural surgery was refined enough to do accurate work on the levels he wished to investigate. But he had Waldos. The smallest Waldos he had used up to this time were approximately half an inch across their palms, with microscanners to match, of course. They were much too gross for his purpose. He wished to manipulate living nerve tissue, examine its insulation and its performance in situ. He used the tiny Waldos to create tinier ones. The last stage was the tiny metal blossoms hardly an eighth of an inch across. The helices, plural of helix. The helices. I'm having a hard time. My brain is saying you're wrong, you're wrong, you're right, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're right, you're wrong. This comes from being tired. The last stage was tiny metal blossoms hardly an eighth of an inch across. The helices in their stems, or forearms, which served them as pseudo-muscles, could hardly be seen by the naked eye. But then he used scanners. His final team of Waldos used for nerve and brain surgery varied in succeeding stages, from mechanical hands nearly life-size down to these fairy digits which could manipulate things much too small for the eye to see. They were mounted in bank to work in the same locus. Waldo controlled them all from the same primaries. He could switch from one size to another without removing his gauntlets. The same change in circuits which brought another size of Waldos under control automatically accomplished the change in sweep of scanning to increase or decrease the magnification, so that Waldo always saw before him in his stereo receiver a life-size image of his other hands. Casual acknowledgement that our boy here, Heinlein, basically uh, might have just invented medical nanomachines. Actually, no, that's not true. Geez, when did Astounding Journey come out? Astounding Voyage? The one where the people shrink themselves down into a tiny little vessel and float through someone's bloodstream. That probably counts as first medical nanomachines, although that's a shrink ray story, but anyway. Digression aside. Where were we? Yes. Waldo, they were mounted in bank to work in the same locus. Oh, wait, I did that already. Each level of Waldo's had its own surgical instruments, its own electrical equipment. It's Waldo's all the way down. Such surgery had never been seen before, but Waldo gave that aspect little thought. No one had told him that such surgery was unheard of. No one had told him that such surgery was unheard of. He established to his own satisfaction the mechanism whereby short-wave radiation had produced a deterioration in human physical performance. The synapses between dendrites acted as if they were points of leakage. Nerve impulses would sometimes fail. Fantastic Voyage! That's the one I'm thinking of. Sorry. Yes, we interrupt ourselves all the time here on stream when it's a Monday and we're totally fried. I'm so sorry. I am so sorry. There we are. He established, to his own satisfaction, the mechanism whereby short-wave radiation had produced a deterioration in human physical performance. The synapses between dendrites acted as if they were points of leakage. Nerve impulses would sometimes fail to make the jump, would leak off. To where? To other space, he was sure. Such leakage seemed to establish a preferred path, a canalization, whereby the condition of the victim became steadily worse. Motor action was not lost entirely, as both paths were still available, but efficiency was lost. It reminded him of a metallic electrical circuit with a partial ground. An unfortunate cat, which had become dead undergoing the experimentation, had supplied him with much of his data. The kitten had been born and raised free from exposure to power radiation. He subjected it to heavy exposure and saw it acquire a myasthenia nearly as complete as his own, while studying in minute detail what actually went on in its nerve tissues. He felt quite sentimental about it when it died. Yet, if Gramps Schneider were right, human beings need not be damaged by radiation. If they had the wit to look at it with the proper orientation, the radiation would not affect them. They might even draw power out of the other world. That was what Gramps Schneider had told him to do. That was what Gramps Schneider had told him to do. Gramps Schneider had told him he need not be weak, that he could be strong. Strong. Strong! He had never thought of it. Schneider's friendly ministrations to him, his advice about overcoming the weakness, he had ignored, had thrown off as inconsequential. His own weakness, his own peculiarity, which made him different from the smooth apes, he had regarded as a basic, implicit fact. He had accepted it as established when he was a small child, a final, unquestioned factor. Naturally, he had paid no attention to Schneider's words insofar as they referred to him. To be strong, to stand alone, to walk, to run. Why, he could go down to Earth's surface without fear. He wouldn't mind the field. They said they didn't mind it. They even carried things. Great heavy things. Everybody did. They threw things. He made a sudden convulsive movement in his primary Waldos, quite unlike his normal, beautifully economical rhythm. The secondaries were oversize, as he was making a new setup. The guys tore loose. A braceplate banged against the wall. Balder was snoozing nearby. He pricked up his ears, looked around, then turned his face to Waldo, questioning him. Waldo glared at him, and the dog whined.
Shut up.
The dog quieted and apologized with his eyes. Have we mentioned that Waldo is like a high-functioning sociopath? He's a terrible human being. Or rather, he's a terrible person. He's very, very, very socially maladjusted. Automatically, he looked over the damage. Not much, but he would have to fix it. Strength. Why, if he were strong, he could do anything. Anything. Number 6 extension Waldos and some new guys. Strong! Absent-mindedly, he shifted to the number 6 Waldos. Strength! He could even meet women, be stronger than they were. He could swim. He could ride. He could fly a ship, run, jump. He could handle things with his bare hands. He could even learn to dance. Strong! He would have muscles. He could break things. He switched to the great Waldos with hands the size of a man's body. Strong. They were strong. With one giant Waldo, he hauled from the stockpile a quarter-inch steel plate, held it up, and shook it. A booming rumble. He shook it again. Strong. He took it in both Waldos, bent it double. The metal buckled unevenly. Convulsively, he crumpled it like waste paper between two large palms. Huge palms. The grinding racket raised hackles on Balder. He himself had not been aware of it. He relaxed for a moment, gasping. There was sweat on his forehead. Blood throbbed in his ears. But he was not spent. He wanted something heavier, stronger. Cutting to the adjoining storeroom, he selected an L-beam 12 feet long, shoved it through to where the giant hands could reach it, and cut back to them. The beam was askew in the port. He wrenched it loose, knocking a big dent in the port frame. He did not notice it. The beam made a fine club in the gross fist. He brandished it. Balder backed away, placing the control ring between himself and the great hands. Power. Strength. Smashing, unbeatable strength! With a spastic jerk, he checked his swing just before the beam touched the wall. No. But he grabbed the other end of the club with the left Waldo and tried to bend it. The big Waldos were built for heavy work, but the beam was built to resist. He strained inside the primaries, strove to force the great fists to do his will. A warning light flashed on his control board. Blindly, he kicked in the emergency overload and persisted. The hum of the Waldos and the rasp of his own breath were drowned out by the harsh scrape of metal on metal as the beam began to give way. Exulting, he bore down harder in the primaries. The beam was bending double when the Waldos blew out. The right-hand tractors let go first. The fist flung open. The left fist, relieved of the strain, threw the steel from it. It tore its way through the thin bulkhead, making a ragged hole, crashed and clanged in the room beyond. But the giant Waldos were inanimate junk. He drew his soft pink hands from the Waldos and looked at them. His shoulders heaved, and racking sobs pushed up out of him. He covered his face with his hands. The tears leaked out between his fingers. Balder whimpered and edged in closer. On the control board, a bell rang persistently. The wreckage had been cleared away, and an adequate, neat patch covered the place where the L-beam had made its own exit. But the giant Waldos had not yet been replaced. Their frame was uninhabited. Waldo was busy rigging a strength tester. It had been years since he had paid any attention to the exact strength of his body. He had had so little use for strength. He had concentrated on dexterity, particularly on the exact and discriminating control of his namesakes. In the selective, efficient, and accurate use of his muscles, he was second to none. He had control. He had to have. He had control. He had to have. But he had had no need for strength. With the mechanical equipment at hand, it was not difficult to jerry-rig a device which would register strength of grip as pounds force on a dial. A spring-loaded scale and a yoke to act on it sufficed. He paused and looked at the contrivance. He need only take off the primary Waldos, place his bare hand on the grip, bear down, and he would know. Still, he hesitated. It felt strange to handle anything so large with his bare hand. Now, reach into the outer world for power. He closed his eyes and pressed. He opened them. 14 pounds, less than he used to have. But he had not yet really tried. He tried to imagine Gramps Schneider's hands on his arm, that warm tingle. Power. Reach out and claim it. 14 pounds, 15, 17, 18, 20, 21. He was winning. He was winning! Both his strength and his courage failed him. In what order, he could not say. The needle spun back to 0. He had to rest. Had he really shown exceptional strength? Or was 21 pounds of grip simply normal for him at his present age and weight? A normally strong and active man, he knew, should have a grip on the order of 150 pounds. Nevertheless, 21 pounds of grip was 6 pounds higher than he had ever before managed on test, sorry. Try again. 10, 11, 12, 13. The needle hesitated. Why, he had just started. This was ridiculous. 14. There it stopped. No matter how he strained and concentrated his driving will, he could not pass that point. Slowly, he dropped back from it. £16 was the highest he managed in the following days. 21 pounds seemed to have been merely a fluke, a good first effort. He ate bitterness. But he had not reached his present position of wealth and prominence by easy surrender. He persisted, recalling carefully just what Schneider had said to him, and trying to feel the touch of Schneider's hands. He told himself now that he really had been stronger under Schneider's touch, but that he had failed to realize it because of the Earth's heavy field. He continued to try. In the back of his mind, he knew that he must eventually seek out Gramps Schneider and ask his help, if he did not find the trick alone. But he was extremely reluctant to do so, not because of the terrible trip it entailed, though that would ordinarily have been more than enough reason, but because if he did so, and Schneider was not able to help him, then there would be no hope at all. It was better to live with disappointment and frustration than to live without hope. He continued to postpone it. Waldo paid little attention to Earth time. He ate and slept when he pleased. He might catch a cat nap at any time. However, at fairly regular intervals he slept for longer periods. Not in a bed, of course. A man who floats in air has no need for a bed. But he did make it a habit to guy himself into place before undertaking 8 hours of solid sleep, as it prevented him from casual drifting in random air currents which might carry him, unconscious, against controls or switches. Since the obsession to become strong had possessed him, he had frequently found it necessary to resort to soporifics to ensure sleep. Dr. Rambeau had returned and was looking for him. Rambeau, crazy and filled with hate. Rambeau, blaming his troubles on Waldo. He was not safe, even in Freehold, as the crazy physicist had found out how to pass from one space to another. There he was now, just his head poked through from the other world.
I'm going to get you, Waldo!
He was gone. No, there he was, behind him. Reaching out with hands that were writhing antennae.
You, Waldo!
But Waldo's own hands were the giant Waldo's. He snatched at Rambeau. The big Waldo's went limp. Rambeau was at him, was on him. He had him around the throat. Gramps Schneider said in his ear, in a voice that was calm and strong,
Reach out for the power, my son. Feel it in your fingers.
Waldo grabbed at the throttling fingers, strained, tried. They were coming loose. He was winning. He would stuff Rambeau back into the other world and keep him there. There! He had one hand free. Baldur was barking frantically. He tried to tell him to shut up, to bite Rambeau, to help. The dog continued to bark. He was in his own home, in his own great room. Baldur let out one more yipe. Quiet! He looked himself over. When he had gone to sleep, he had been held in place by 4 light guys, opposed like the axes of a tetrahedron. 2 of them were still fastened to his belt. He swung loosely against the control ring. Of the other 2, one had snapped off at his belt. Its end floated a few feet away. The 4th had been broken in 2 places, near his belt and again several feet out. The severed piece was looped loosely around his neck. He looked the situation over. Study as he might, he could conceive no way in which the guys could have been broken save by his own struggles in the nightmare. The dog could not have done it. He had no way to get a purchase. He had done it himself. The lines were light, being intended merely as stays. Still, it took him a few minutes to rig a testing apparatus which would test pull instead of grip. The yoke had to be reversed. When it was done, he cut in a medium Waldo pair, fastened, pulled the severed piece of line to the tester, and, using the Waldo, pulled. The line parted at 212 pounds. Hastily, but losing time because of nervous clumsiness, he re-rigged the tester for grip. He paused, whispered softly, "Now is the time, Gramps," and bore down on the grip. 20 pounds, 21, 25, up past 30. He was not even sweating. 35, 40, 1, 2, 3, 45, and 6 and a half. 47 pounds. With a great sigh, he let his hand relax. He was strong. Strong. When he had somewhat regained his composure, he considered what to do next. His first impulse was to call Grimes, but he suppressed it. Soon enough, when he was sure of himself. He went back to the tester and tried his left hand. Not as strong as his right, but almost. nearly 45 pounds. Funny thing, he didn't feel any different. Just normal, healthy, no sensation. He wanted to try all of his muscles. It would take too long to rig testers for kick and shove and backlift and, a dozen others. He needed a field, that was it, a 1G field. Well, there was the reception room. It could be centrifuged. But its controls were in the ring, and it was long corridors away. There was a nearer one, the centrifuge for the cuckoo clock. He had rigged the wheel with a speed control as an easy way to regulate the clock. He moved back to the control ring and stopped the turning of the big wheel. The clockwork was disturbed by the sudden change. The little red bird popped out, said, "Doo-woo, doo-woo," once, hopefully, and subsided. Carrying in his hand a small control panel radio hooked to the motor which impelled the centrifuge wheel, he propelled himself to the wheel and placed himself inside, planting his feet on the inner surface of the rim and grasping one of the spokes, so that he would be in a standing position with respect to the centrifugal force, once it was impressed. He started the wheel slowly. Its first motion surprised him, and he almost fell off. But he recovered himself and gave it a little more power. All right, so far. He speeded it up gradually, triumph spreading through him as he felt the pull of the pseudo-gravitational field, felt his legs grow heavy, but still strong. He let it out, 1 full G. He could take it. He could indeed. To be sure, the force did not affect the upper part of his body so strongly as the lower, as his head was only a foot or so from the point of rotation. He could fix that. He squatted down slowly, hanging on tight to the spoke. It was all right. But the wheel swayed, and the motor complained. His unbalanced weight, that far out from the center of rotation, was putting too much of a strain on a framework intended to support a cuckoo clock, and its counterweight only. He straightened up with equal caution, feeling the fine shove of his thigh muscles and calves. He stopped the wheel. Balder had been much perturbed by the whole business. He had almost twisted his neck off trying to follow the motions of Waldo. He still postponed calling Grimes. He wanted to arrange for some selective local controls on the centrifuging of the reception room, in order to have a proper place in which to practice standing up. Then he had to get the hang of this walking business. It looked easy, but he didn't know. Might be quite a trick to learn it. Thereafter, he planned to teach Balder to walk. He tried to get Balder into the cuckoo clock wheel, but the dog objected. He wiggled free and retreated to the farthest part of the room. No matter. When he had the beast in the reception room, he would damn well have to learn to walk. Should have seen to it long ago. A big brute like that, and couldn't walk. He visualized a framework into which the dog could be placed, which would force him to stand erect. It was roughly equivalent to a baby's toddler, but Waldo did not know that. He had never seen a baby's toddler.
Uncle Gus.
Oh, hello, Waldo. How you been?
Fine. Look, Uncle Gus, can you come up to Freehold right away?
Grimes shook his head.
Sorry, my bus is in the shop.
Your bus is too slow anyhow. Get a taxi, or get somebody to drive you.
And have you insult him when we get there?
I'll be sweet as sugar.
Well, Jimmy Stevens said something yesterday about wanting to see you.
Waldo grinned.
Get him. I'd like to see him.
I'll try.
Call me back. Make it soon.
Waldo met them in the reception room, which he had left uncentrifuged. As soon as they came in, he started his act.
My, I'm glad you're here. Dr. Stevens, could you fly me down to Earth right away? Something's come up.
Why, I suppose so.
Let's go.
Wait a minute.
Wait a minute, Waldo. Jimmy's not prepared to handle you the way you have to be handled.
I'll have to chance it, Uncle Gus. This is urgent.
But...
No buts. Let's leave at once.
They hustled Balder into the ship and tied him down. Grimes saw to it that Waldo's chair was tilted back in the best approximation of a deceleration rig. Waldo settled himself into it and closed his eyes to discourage questions. He sneaked a look and found Grimes grimly silent. Stevens made very nearly a record trip, but set them down quite gently on the parking flat over Grimes's house. Grimes touched Waldo's arm.
How do you feel? I'll get someone and we'll get you inside. I want to get you to bed.
Can't do that, Uncle Gus. Things to do. Give me your arm, will you?
Huh?
But Waldo reached for the support requested and drew himself up. I'll be all right now, I guess. He let go of the physician's arm and started for the door. Will you untie Balder?
Waldo!
He turned around, grinning happily. Yes, Uncle Gus, it's true. I'm not weak anymore. I can walk. Grimes took hold of the back of one of the seats and said shakily,
Waldo, I'm an old man. You ought not to do things like this to me.
He wiped at his eyes. Yes, agreed Stevens. It's a damn dirty trick. Waldo looked blankly from one face to the other. I'm sorry, he said humbly. I just wanted to surprise you. It's all right. Let's go downside and have a drink. You can tell us about it then. That could be Grimes. That could be Stevens. I don't know. There's no way to be sure. I'm going to guess it was Grimes, and I just misread it.
It's all right. Let's go downside and have a drink. You can tell us about it then.
All right. Come on, Balder. The dog got up and followed after his master. He had a very curious gait. Waldo's trainer gadget had taught him to pace instead of trot. Waldo stayed with Grimes for days, gaining strength, gaining new reflex patterns, building up his flabby muscles. He had no setbacks. The myasthenia was gone. All he required was conditioning. Grimes had forgiven him at once for his unnecessarily abrupt and spectacular revelation of his cure, but Grimes had insisted that he take it easy and become fully readjusted before he undertook to venture out unescorted. It was a wise precaution. Even simple things were hazards to him. Stairs, for example. He could walk on the level, but going downstairs had to be learned. Going up was not so difficult. Stevens showed up one day, let himself in, and found Waldo alone in the living room listening to a stereo show. Hello, Mr. Jones. Oh, hello, Stevens. Waldo reached down hastily, fumbled for his shoes, zipped them on. Uncle Gus says I should wear them all the time, he explained. Everybody does, but you caught me unawares. Ah, that's no matter. You don't have to wear them in the house. Where's Doc? Gone for the day. Don't you, really? Seems to me my nurses always wore shoes. Oh, yes, everybody does, but there's no law to make you. Then I'll wear them, but I can't say that I like them. They feel dead, like a pair of disconnected Waldos. But I want to learn how. How to wear shoes? How to act like people act. It's really quite difficult, he said seriously. Stevens felt a sudden insight, a welling of sympathy for this man with no background and no friends. It must be odd and strange to him. He felt an impulse to confess something which had been on his mind with respect to Waldo. You really are strong now, aren't you? Waldo grinned happily. Getting stronger every day. I gripped 200 pounds this morning, and see how much fat I've worked off. You're looking fit, all right. Here's a funny thing. Ever since I first met you, I've wished to high heaven that you were as strong as an ordinary man. You really did? Why? Well, I think you will admit that you used some pretty poisonous language to me one time and another. You had me riled up all the time. I wanted you to get strong so that I could just beat the hell out of you. Waldo had been walking up and down, getting used to his shoes. He stopped and faced Stevens. He seemed considerably startled. "You mean you wanted to fist fight me?" "Exactly. You used language to me that a man ought not to use unless he is prepared to back it up with his fists. If you had not been an invalid, I would have pasted you one, any number of times." Waldo seemed to be struggling with a new concept. "I think I see," he said slowly. "Well, all right." On the last word, he delivered a roundhouse swipe with plenty of power behind it. Stevens was not in the least expecting it. It happened to catch him on the button. He went down, out cold. When he came to, he found himself in a chair. Waldo was shaking him. "Wasn't that right?" he said anxiously.
What did you hit me with?
"My hand. Wasn't that right? Wasn't that what you wanted?"
Wasn't that what I...
He still had little bright lights floating in front of his eyes, but the situation began to tickle him.
Look here! Is that your idea of the proper way to start a fight?
"Isn't it?" Stevens tried to explain to him the etiquette of fisticuffs, contemporary American. Waldo seemed puzzled, but finally he nodded. "I get it. You have to give the other man warning. All right, get up and we'll do it over."
Easy, easy! Wait a minute. You never did give me a chance to finish what I was saying. I was sore at you, but I'm not anymore. That is what I was trying to tell you. Oh, you were utterly poisonous. There is no doubt about that. But you couldn't help being.
"I don't mean to be poisonous," Waldo said seriously.
I know you don't, and you're not. I rather like you now that you're strong.
"Do you really?"
Yes, I do. But don't practice any more of those punches on me.
"I won't. But I didn't understand. But do you know, Dr. Stevens, it's—"
Call me Jim.
"Jim, it's a very hard thing to know just what people do expect. There is so little pattern to it. Take belching. I didn't know it was forbidden to burp when other people are around. It seems obviously necessary to me, but Uncle Gus says not." Stevens tried to clear up the matter for him. Not too well, as he found that Waldo was almost totally lacking in any notion, even theoretical, of social conduct. Not even from fiction had he derived a concept of the intricacies of mores, as he had read almost no fiction. He had ceased reading stories in his early boyhood because he lacked the background of experience necessary to appreciate fiction. He was rich, powerful, and a mechanical genius, but he still needed to go to kindergarten. Waldo had a proposition to make. "Jim, you've been very helpful. You explain these things better than Uncle Gus does. I'll hire you to teach me." Stevens suppressed a slight feeling of pique.
Sorry, I've got a job that keeps me busy.
"Oh, that's all right. I'll pay you better than they do. You can name your own salary. It's a deal." Stevens took a deep breath and sighed.
You don't understand. I'm an engineer, and I don't hire out for personal service. You can't hire me. Oh, I'll help you all I can, but I won't take money for it.
"What's wrong with taking money?"
The question, Stevens thought, was stated wrongly. As it stood, it could not be answered. He launched into a long, involved discussion of professional and business conduct. He was really not fitted for it. Waldo soon bogged down.
"I'm afraid I don't get it. But see here, could you teach me how to behave with girls? Uncle Gus says he doesn't dare take me out in company."
Well, I'll try. I'll certainly try. But, Waldo, I came over to see you about some of the problems we're running into at the plant. About this theory of the two spaces that you were telling me about.
"It's not theory, it's fact."
All right. What I want to know is this. When do you expect to go back to Freehold and resume research? We need some help.
"Go back to Freehold? I haven't any idea. I don't intend to resume research."
You don't? But, my heavens, you haven't finished half the investigations you outlined to me.
"You fellows can do 'em. I'll help out with suggestions, of course."
Well, maybe we could interest Gramps Schneider, Stevens said doubtfully.
"I would not advise it," Waldo answered. "Let me show you a letter he sent me." He left it.
and he left and fetched it back. Here. Stevens glanced through it. Your generous offer of your share in the new power project I appreciate, but truthfully I have no interest in such things and would find the responsibility a burden. As for the news of your new strength, I am happy, but not surprised. The power of the other world is his who would claim it. There was more to it. It was written in a precise Spencerian hand, a trifle shaky. The rhetoric showed none of the colloquialisms with which Schneider spoke. I think I see what you mean.
I believe, Waldo said seriously, that he regards our manipulations with gadgets as rather childish.
I suppose. Tell me, what do you intend to do with yourself?
Me? I don't know exactly, but I can tell you this. I'm going to have fun. I'm going to have lots of fun. I'm just beginning to find out how much fun it is to be a man.
His dresser tackled the other slipper.
To tell you just why I took up dancing would be a long story, he continued.
I want details. Hospital calling, someone in the dressing room said.
Tell him I'll be right there, fast. Suppose you come in tomorrow afternoon, he added to the woman reporter. Can you?
Right. A man was shouldering his way through the little knot around him. Waldo caught his eye.
Hello, Stanley. Glad to see you.
Hello, Waldo.
Gleason pulled some papers out from under his cape and dropped them in the dancer's lap.
Brought these over myself as I wanted to see your act again.
Like it?
Swell.
Waldo grinned and picked up the papers.
Where is the dotted line?
Better read them first,
Gleason cautioned him.
Oh, shucks, no. If it suits you, it suits me. Can I borrow your stylus?
A worried little man worked his way up to them.
About that recording, Waldo.
We've discussed that, Waldo said flatly. I only perform before audiences.
We've combined it with the Warm Springs benefit.
That's different. Okay.
While you're about it, let's take a look at this layout.
It was a reduction for a 24 sheet.
The Great Waldo and his Troupe.
With the opening date and theater left blank, but with a picture of Waldo as Harlequin posed high in the air.
Fine, Sam, fine.
Waldo nodded happily.
Hospital calling again.
I'm ready now,
Waldo answered, and stood up. His dresser draped his street cape over his lean shoulders. Waldo whistled sharply.
Here, Balder, come along.
At the door he stopped an instant and waved.
Good night, fellows.
Good night, Waldo.
They were all such grand guys. And that was Waldo by Robert A. Heinlein. As a kind of abrupt happy ending there. Kind of comes almost out of nowhere, but it was prepped for it. Right in the very beginning, there's that opener with the ballet dancing, but you don't necessarily know it's Waldo yet. But yeah, that was Waldo. So anybody who's into mecha and giant robots and, you know, mechanical articulation and the like, I think should have gotten something out of that as kind of a foundational cornerstone of the conceptualization of how you could use stuff like that. In practical terms, because this is an early example of doing that, and of course that's now very much a real technology that we use, that's regularly used in many different applications, be they military, be they medical, what have you, which I think is really rad, life imitating art, so to speak. It's like, oh yeah, this is a brilliant idea. Yeah, we should do this. This makes sense. So sometimes all it takes is somebody like reading about some interesting idea and then just kind of pontificating or speculating on it. And then eventually you can get something useful out of the whole deal. Sometimes that's all it takes. Anyway, that'll do it for this week, for this stream for this week. Next week we'll get cracking on Magic Incorporated, which, if memory serves, is kind of a mystery whodunit. It's been a while since I've read it, so We'll see if I'm remembering correctly. I do have other streams throughout the week. For anyone tuning in for the first time, hi, welcome. If you're wondering why these are so rough, it's because I do them live in front of a live studio audience of whoever's tuning in that day. I stream to both Twitch and YouTube. YouTube is where you're going to probably get most of your mileage because they're all uploaded there. I stream live starting at about noon Eastern Standard Time. Sometimes a little late. Sometimes I'm a little late. Crunchy. I had some other spiel. Oh yeah, I stream Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Mondays are Mecha Mondays, where I read something giant robot related or mecha adjacent. Wednesdays right now are Wuxio Wednesdays. I don't have a pithy, punchy descriptor line. Right now we're reading through Legends of the Condor Heroes, Book 1, A Hero Born by Jin Yong. It is a great kung fu book. It is a lot of fun. I enjoy it. And Fridays are Free Read Fridays, where I read short stories and indeed entire novels aloud. This Friday will be the final installment of the Hyperion Cantos by Dan Simmons, the last bit of the Fall of Hyperion. Get excited. Things are going to be pretty nuts. With that, I got to run. Thanks again for tuning in. Stay safe, stay sane, and be decent to each other.